All right, I think we're live. Welcome, everybody. My name is Bill Franks. I'm going to host a panel here on the role of the data translator. If you happen to be here this morning, you may have seen me give a talk on a variety of new roles that are up and coming in the world of analytics and data science. Obviously, the focus of this conference specifically has been that of a data translator or analytics translator. And so what we're going to do today is bring in a couple of folks from industry who have some various opinions on this. And I'm just going to lead a little bit of a moderated discussion for the next hour around their thoughts. We may have some time for some questions as well. So if you come up with some of those as we go, feel free to drop those in. And depending on how we're doing on time, I can see about doing it. So first, I'll just introduce the panelists that we have. The first one is Shanshan Ding. She is the Director of Data Science at the online dating app Hinge. She leads a team of data scientists in applying machine learning and advanced analytics to the various aspects of product. I'm sure that's a very interesting area to apply all the analytics to. And prior to that role, she had a role in academia as a mathematician and educator. We also have Ilyas Iyoob. He's focused on AI for autonomous computing, space tech, and blockchain. He had a startup company that he sold to IBM, and he's now, in addition to that, doing some venture capital advisement and teaching at the University of Texas, Austin in the area of AI. And last, we have Eric Schmidt. He's the Global Director of Data and Analytics at the Coca-Cola Company in my hometown here, Atlanta. His career spans several industries, including banking, risk management, hospitality, and consumer packaged goods. In fact, I think I first met Eric when he was at a hospitality company. He's an alumnus of the Georgia Institute of Technology and Emory's Business School. So with that, I think we've got a great panel. And, you know, as the day's gone on, I know there's been a lot of opinions around data translator and what that means. And I guess, you know, Eric, maybe we'll start with you around getting some semantics out of the way. The events around a data translator, I know I also hear a lot about analytics translators. Do you see a difference between the two? Are they the same, or how do they relate?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And to be honest, I hadn't really understood that there were different terms applied to this role of translator, let's say. And so I actually, you know, did the typical thing in preparation for this question. The modern day version of looking it up in the dictionary, I went and Googled it. And, you know, I found actually two interesting articles, one by McKinsey and one in Forbes, dating back to 2018, actually. And the McKinsey article talked about analytics translators, and the Forbes article talks. And essentially, the description of both the roles were
Shanshan, did it go quiet for you as well?
Yeah.
We'll give him a second and see if he makes it back.
Okay, so it looks like Eric is trying to reconnect.
Yeah. We'll have him try without his camera if he gets back in. Well, he may not realize that he got the boot. Well, we'll wait for him, Ilyas. I know, I think you might have had some thoughts on this topic as well.
Right. So we've had this challenge of trying to find people who can connect the dots. Right. At the end of the day, this data translator is somebody who's trying to connect between these different groups. You've got the business team that wants to get something done. You've got the data scientists that need a problem to solve, and then you've got the the engineering and the development teams that, you know, whatever's done here has to move on. So there is a need for this role, but and I see Eric back on, but yeah, we see this term and we essentially think of both of them as exactly the same. So it's whether it's data translator or analytics translator. It just so happens that some organizations that have an analytics vertical, going all the way to chief analytics officer. They typically call them as analytical translators. And then the more newer teams that are just starting off with data science teams, they probably call them the data translators.
And Eric, I see you made it back. I think we lost you. You had mentioned 2 articles, and you said,
Okay.
if I recall, McKinsey called it an analytics translator, and Forbes. And that's all I got.
Yeah. Okay. So it's cut out of Forbes. I apologize. I switched over to a different Wi-Fi network in my house. So hopefully this will resolve any kind of bandwidth issues I may be having at home here. Yeah, so the second one was a Forbes article that talked about a data translator, whereas McKinsey was an analytics translator. And in reading both perspectives, essentially the definition of the role was identical. So, at least from these 2 kind of, sources, there wasn't really a distinction in terms of what that role would be doing, whether you call it an analytics translator or a data translator. And really, the key thing there for this role, and I think the key need in the business, is to connect the technical side of the business with the business side of the company. And I think there are 2 elements to this. One is looking at the business side from the technical side. Are we asking the right business questions? So I think there's maybe some responsibility for the technical resources to make sure, guide or steer the business stakeholders to make sure that they're asking, what the right business questions are. And then from the business perspective, looking at the technical side, it really has to be, is the technical team producing solutions that answer those key business questions? Or are the technical resources creating some fancy data science project looking for some business question to apply it to? So I think that is the real need that we're seeing in companies and business today, is someone who can play the role between the deep technical assets and the business stakeholders to make sure that the right solutions are being created to drive value for the business.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. And I think when you're out, Ilyas gave a few thoughts there. So let's move on to the next one. And I guess this time we'll start with you, Ilyas. Historically, when there was obviously some of this translation work done, but it had typically fallen onto the people like us on the call who did that work. And I think historically that worked okay in some cases. At the same time, it really stretched some other people, and it had some uneven success. Why do you think it was so difficult to succeed, and what's making this role suddenly emerge today?
So let me take that apart a little bit. So the unevenness of, it works sometimes and it doesn't work sometimes, right? Which is kind of interesting. Why is it that it works that you don't an assigned data translator might not be needed in some teams, but in some others you really, really badly need one? And what I've seen is that in just within some of the roles I've had within IBM, in some industries there is a certain level of expectation that people have from what they think data scientists can do. And so there's this mismatch of expectations. You have business users that think they know what they could get out of data science, and then you have the data scientists that are far from that in terms of what data they can get and what they can actually do. So there's a little bit of a mismatch there between what the expectations are and what can actually be done. So I think, and then whereas in some other domains, you see that there's not that much of a mismatch because it's a very new space anyway, and so they're sort of all working together. So coming back to when we see this type of mismatch, it helps to educate the teams a little more about what data science can actually do, and then and not to sort of I hear this all the time. Well, it's. They'll say, well, it's like the Amazon recommendations. Why can't you just do it for this, right? Or it's like Netflix, or it's like, but no, it's not like that, right? You might need, user preference data for something. You may not have user preference data for something else. So I think setting expectations well a lot of times helps with being able to solve this problem in a more easy manner. And then, according to why is it more now than before? Well, we live in a world where AI is all over us, right? Where, our phones are run with AI, our cars are running with AI, our homes are smart. So the general public is more aware of AI, but that also causes a challenge because they know more about it. They also have very sort of simplistic expectations of what data scientists should be able to do for them. And of course, yeah, well, why can't you do it? It's so easy. It's so straightforward, right?
But I think it was funny when you said about it's just like that, just go do it. Even though we complain about that, I'll admit I have to catch myself when I'm talking to an electrician or an IT person. Well, come on, just hook the two computers up or just switch out that
Right.
thing. And I have to remind myself it's probably not as easy for them as I think it is, like people do to us. But Shanshan, I know you had some thoughts on this as well, I believe.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything Ilyas has said. I think probably in addition, I think historically, it might not even be clear a priori that a layer translation between data analytics practitioners and business stakeholders are necessary. But I think in practice, especially depending on where a company is, the business people may not know what analytics applications exist that could solve business problems. And the analytics practitioners may not know what business problems exist that they could have value for. So I think that's another reason why historically, in some companies, not having dedicated data translators or even awareness of this role has been fine, but in other companies, this has maybe been a blocker to leveraging the value of data analytics.
Well, Citra, you mentioned about this role, so Shanshan, let's just have you move forward with that thought. When you think about this role, is it a role that people do as part of the job? Is it a full-time standalone position or a mix? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think I am biased by my experience, which is that I have worked at small to medium-sized companies. I think at a 30-person company, it is probably difficult to justify having a full-time data translator with a title data translator, and that's all they do. I think at a 30,000 person company, potentially there is some economy of scale by having a dedicated group of data translators. So I think, at the companies that I've worked at, because of their size, the role of data translator has more or less been taken on either by product managers, business people, or data scientists. And I think it also depends on, what is the application of data science at a company. I think potentially, if the output of data science is business insight, that's going to be used by a business team to make decisions. So example is, let's say understand trend in user retention or even forecasting, maybe revenue. Potentially, you don't need a dedicated data translator. But I think if you want to leverage data and in an automatic way that is user-facing, so if you want to build a data product, so for example, recommender system or fraud detection, then it might be helpful to have dedicated data translators because they could help you answer questions like, what are resources you need to do this? What are the risks in building such a system? And in particular, if the underlying mechanisms are not interpretable, how do you justify the resources and risks? I think because data products potentially are more resource extensive, resource extensive, and they're also a little riskier. I think that side of data science is probably where data translators are more necessary.
Great. And it looks like we had a little glitch with Eric again. Hopefully he'll get back in because you made a key point about the size of not just the analytics organization, but maybe the company as a whole could influence how you would put that role into place. And obviously, Eric has some experience at the opposite end of the spectrum where the employee counts are in the tens or hundreds of thousands. So I'll give him just a minute or two to pop back in here. And if we don't get lucky, then we'll do another question.
So in the meantime, when it comes to smaller companies, as Shanshan was saying, Usually, the people that are hired in smaller companies are probably a little bit more mature, and if they are in key positions, and so usually they already somewhat are able to handle some of that communication, right? Because they were hired to solve a very business-like problem, and they have the data science skills, and so they kind of come in with the assumption that, well, of course I have to translate, otherwise, whatever I build isn't gonna go anywhere. But then when it comes to larger companies where we have 400 or 500 data scientists on a team, it gets very, oh yeah, sure, I could, I guess, but I don't really have to. So and they kind of let the manager of data science or their team manager deal with it, right? So
Yeah.
a lot of it goes to, and this is also, we're dealing with a generational, a new generation of data scientists who are more used to remote communication, right? Text-based communication as opposed to verbal communication. And data translators have to be extremely verbal. And it's all about interpreting what somebody is saying and being able to kind of perceive their emotion and what is really bothering somebody and kind of how being able to fix it. That does require face-to-face interaction of some sort, right? And so there is a little bit of a generational gap there too, which you see more in the larger companies, but not so much in the smaller ones.
Yeah.
That ties. There's one of the questions that came in through the app here. It talks about whether the data translator role is best served by an outside consultant or a full-time hire. And the person who submitted, looks like Andrew Lund submitted this and said he suggests that for continuity, it's probably best to have an employee. I'll throw in my thoughts and maybe each of you can chime in. I would argue, yeah, absolutely. This is such a critical role. Ideally, it's an employee because they'll be there to persist, not just during that implementation, but moving forward. If there's questions on how to use it, doesn't mean that you can't have a consultant play that role when you're in a bind or if there's a project you're not familiar with. But ideally, in my mind, I would see this preferably being somebody on the inside. It's not the kind of thing that's easy to outsource, like cranking out the code. Either of you guys have a thought about that?
I think it probably depends on what is the problem that you want the data translator to solve. I think if you have very specific problems that you want your team of data scientists to answer, then it most likely benefits you to have an in-person employee. But I think if in general you say, well, my organization has a problem where we want to understand how we can leverage data analytics, or why we're not leveraging data analytics as well as we think we should, then maybe in that case, it's helpful to have an outside consultant.
Yeah, and Bill, I'm always of the opinion of, you have to have skin in the game, right? As a data translator, you have to be responsible for the outcome of the work that's being done. And if you're responsible for the work, then you're going to find a way to get everybody to communicate and understand what needs to happen so that you can move forward and get things done. But what I have seen, though, is that, so sometimes I get called upon in the VC space where there'll be a company, they've got mostly smaller companies, they've got 3 or 4 data scientists, and there's complete disconnect between the CEO and a couple of the founders, and they thought they could solve a problem, and they went and hired 3 data scientists from campus, and then they're speaking 2 different languages and they have no clue what. So at that time, I go in from the outside, and then that helps a little bit to listen to both perspectives and then try to find out how they can communicate better. So from the outside, you can help to find the gaps and then help them reconnect, but then that reconnection work again has to happen from the inside.
Yeah, I'll jump to another one real quick here that came in through the questions. Conrad asked about how this translator role is really different from some of the existing roles we've had, like a business analyst or business system analyst that were tasked with working with business to gather requirements and such. And, I think part of it, in my mind, it's an evolution. Those roles have been around. They often, unfortunately, were more lower level organizationally. They weren't necessarily a role that was considered mission critical from a business perspective. They were often viewed as critical from the technical perspective of gathering those requirements and documenting the requirements, as opposed to, I see this translator role as a little more of a partnership and a strategic resource to that business side. I don't know if Ilyas or Shanshan, if either of you had a thought on that question.
No, go ahead, Shanshan.
I mean, I think it's just kind of a gradual differentiation of roles as as the general public has embraced more and more data analytics. I think depending on the organization, again, it doesn't have to be different. But I think, as Ilyas mentioned earlier, there is a pretty big difference from saying, well, Amazon has a recommender system, why don't we also implement one? And actually being able to do that. And that execution oftentimes is helped along by having people in the translator role.
Yeah, I'll say if you're someone who has a business analyst or systems analyst title, back to evolve yourself, I'd consider attempting to get your company to relabel you in some fashion, right? I mean, it's a much cooler title today to be a data translator, just like people that were doing analytics and building predictive models, or started having the nomenclature around data science as that field evolved. I think there's opportunity in some of these changes for folks. I see, Eric, we got you back. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I'm sorry again. I had to mute my camera for a second, and it kind of kicked me out. And then I was trying to get back in, and I wasn't sure how to do that. So finally, it popped back up. So
this is a great lead-in then. With your lack of technical literacy, as we've gone through this process, it rises. Speaking of the big issue of data literacy that's so popular today out there, and that's becoming a hotter and hotter topic. Do you see the rise of translators in any way being tied to the rise in data literacy, or do you see those as two independent trends that might intersect a bit?
Yeah, so data literacy, and it could be, I guess, again, grouped as data and analytics literacy. I think that's something that's really valuable for a data translator, for the technical side of the business to build in the rest of the organization or in the stakeholders. It makes the job of doing the analytics and the translation all that much easier if the folks who are leveraging that information to make decisions understand where it's coming from and how you got there, et cetera. So I do think there is a part that data and analytics translators can play in building data literacy. And that could be through, helping to upskill the company, participating in training or helping drive training, et cetera. However, in some companies, you may see roles or titles like data evangelist or something to that effect, or chief data scientist or something like that. And where I've seen those roles with those titles, it seems like those are the folks who are really driving that data literacy across the organization. And it's more of a capability building, a knowledge building kind of activity versus that translator role, which is understanding the business need and creating requirements and forming that into solutions that then get delivered back to the business to answer those questions. But yeah, I think there's definitely a role that the data translator can play in helping build that data literacy in whatever company or organization, because it's going to benefit them to help them do their job as well.
Great. I think, Shanshan, you had mentioned you had some thoughts on this general topic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, I think, data translators in either their day-to-day role or in proactively educating the rest of the company could go a long way in improving data literacy. But I think probably even beyond that, when a company designates people as data translators and that becomes a formalized role, that itself, I think, sets a tone that the entire organization needs to understand that data literacy is a shared responsibility. So I think this is a situation where not only could data translators help, just their existence sets the tone for the company.
It looks like Bill's frozen this time.
Okay, so until Bill joins, I see there's a question that came in from Richard Finnegan. It's a very, very interesting question, and it's about somebody who is assigned this role of being a data translator. If that's not a full-time role, then how do they balance between sort of the strategic, communication across and the sort of heads down, get things done delivery, right? And this is Bill, I was just picking up one of the questions from the chat while you were out for a second.
Okay.
So it's a question from Richard about how do you balance if a data translator is, not a full-time position, how does this person who does this balance strategic work with like delivery, day-to-day operational work, right? And that's a very good question, because this is what it comes down to on it, at least I think for myself and probably for some of you as well, where we have to do data translation to get things, to be able to move the company in the right direction. But at the same time, we have teams working with us that have to get, work done on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that worked well for us, and this is something that is done across IBM, so it's not specific to data science, it just happens to work well in data science, is these design thinking sessions. And I don't know if you guys have done very much of these, but these are sort of whiteboarding sessions where you bring all the stakeholders early on, and the data translator plays an important role there in making sure we empathize with the real problem, find out that do we really have the data to solve that problem? If we were to solve it, what would it really look like? So by doing these sessions and then sort of bringing out the concerns of everybody, and then once that's set, and then you have what they call hills, which is kind of like checkpoints of where you need to get done. Once you've set that up, you have a little bit of breathing space to go and get something done, right? Because you know that everybody's at least somewhat on the same page for a brief period of time, and then again you go back and have that conversation. So in the absence of a full-time data translator, tools like design thinking that help to keep everybody informed and bring everybody's concerns and document it and then feed that into the requirements process really helps with organizing some of that, because some of this is process related as well, right?
Great. Yeah. And, one thing, I guess, we've talked about these people and the value that they can add. Shanshan, when you think about a data translator, what are some of the specific skills and/or background in terms of work experience generally that you think would lend itself to being successful in such a role?
I don't know specifically about work experience, but because I think modern day tech is there's so many different positions that are more and more differentiated, but you can really, I think, get into any of these positions from a variety of background. But I think in terms of skills, obviously it starts with data literacy. So I think someone who is a data translator themselves need to be data literate. So I think that means they need to know how business can benefit from different types of analytics. They need to be able to create and interpret data at let's say, an aggregate level, especially in visual forms. And they need to be able to think critically about information that's provided by data analysts. They also obviously need to have very strong communication skills. So I think that means make and communicate data-driven decisions and explain complex ideas to different audiences. I think that's key, being able to cater their communication to different audiences. And I think finally, to me, what's important is that they need to have a certain amount of self-awareness. They need to understand what they don't know, because they're not experts either in data analytics or business decision making, but they need to be the bridge between the two. And then I think finally, they also need to know what they don't need to know, right? So for instance, the business has a need to detect fraud. They need to understand that's some kind of binary classification problem, but I don't think they know exactly what is logistic regression and how it works. So I think in summary, data literacy, communication skills, and self-awareness.
Great. Ilyas, any thoughts on that?
I think Shanshan covered most of it. The only thing that I would probably add to that is it's not really a skill, but I think it's a characteristic of good data translators, or they're able to gain the trust of the people that are with them, right? Because only then will they be able to go the long haul. So somebody who's able to infer what is really concerning to the business unit, and then be open with them to say, well, I know you want to solve that, but we really, we would like to solve it as well, but we just don't have what it takes to solve it. But here's another related problem that can be solved. And on a related note, sometimes when a data translator is able to tell a business unit, you know what, you can solve that problem with simple BI. You probably don't even need AI for that problem, right? And when you turn back around as an AI team, you turn and say you don't need AI. That really builds that trust with them to say, oh, these guys are on our side. They're trying to help us solve the problem instead of just trying to, try to pull work onto their side and get funded for it or whatever, right? So that helps.
Shanshan, one thing you said that I think is interesting. We've talked about data literacy a number of times, and people generally, at least from the technical side and the analytics side of the house, we tend to say the data literacy is about having to educate those crazy business people who don't understand anything we do. Well, literacy is about reading and writing. And frankly, I think a lot of times we could look inwardly as well and say, are we communicating it well enough that we should expect that they'd be able to read that? So I think that's where a translator is also helping with that a little bit, is that acknowledgement that it needs to be better presented and spoken as well as better heard and received. I think those are two different sides of the same coin. So Eric, one thing, you work for a huge company, obviously, and I've worked for several. So as you think about the role of a data translator and you start to think about the scale of a large global organization, how do you make this kind of a role actually work then at scale across that org?
Yeah, so Coca-Cola, the Coca-Cola company, we embarked on a fairly major reorg at the end of last year, and we're still kind of in the process of going through the organization. I'll say it's mainly complete now, but one of the stated objectives from the leadership for this reorganization was to create this corporate function called platform services. And in platform services, you have things like traditional IT, you have other services-oriented type functions. So things oriented towards marketing, towards finance, towards HR. And it's kind of a vertical end-to-end from IT through to the business to the actual functional leads in region and in corporate, a services function that provides solutions, including this data translation. So I would say, the Coca-Cola company is like right in the middle of scaling this up, to be honest. and it's all new. It's all new for us. I'd say we are probably learning as we're going, learning and adjusting potentially. But I think we're headed in the right direction. So one way to scale up this role is to think about how do you organize overall in a big company. I'm talking specifically about a big company setting. Whether you have kind of a COE or a centralized capability that you then distribute across multiple functions or geographic organization, or do you have kind of a lean center with more direct support within a geographic region or within a function, et cetera? Or do you just have everything in silos? We've obviously gone more towards the kind of COE or centralized kind of capability, but we still do have kind of a hybrid solution, I'd say. So, in terms of scaling up this role, this data translator role, I think it is something that can benefit from that economy of scale, as Shanshan pointed out earlier. And that's what you're seeing in our company. And I'm also seeing this, by the way, in several other large companies through contact and communication with some of my colleagues at other organizations.
Yeah, there's a question came in, and I'm gonna add a ancillary question after done with it. But I do like this one. So, what are your thoughts in terms of the general level of pay for a data translator? And one of the things I talk about is that this should actually be a pretty senior role, someone who's very experienced, whether it be from the business or analytics side, who's earned the trust and respect of the entire organization, knows the business, knows the kind of analytics that are being done, who can step in and say, we're going to make that Amazon-style recommendation engine. It won't be easy, but I can see a path to it. So I personally would see it as a fairly expensive role, possibly in time one of your most expensive roles. because of the critical nature of it. But I don't know if what you guys have seen in your organizations or as other people talk about it, or do you view it as an expensive, inexpensive, or medium role? Shanshan, let's start with you.
It's a little difficult for me to answer because having worked at small companies, I've not worked at companies where we have dedicated data translators. That said, I think if I were to project, I would agree that this should be a well-compensated role, because this really is a role that has a multiplier effect. It serves to leverage and multiply the skills of existing data science and data analytics teams. So by that standard, it should be well compensated.
Ilyas, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I've done a little bit on the small companies and some time now in the large companies. So I would say that yeah, it should be a pretty senior role, but not all the way up to like a chief data scientist or a chief analytics officer or even their chief of staff, because they have mainstream business decisions to also help with, internal company decisions that they also need to help with. So I think, at the level of a director of data science or a manager of data science, I think where they have people that are getting work done and they are closely connected with, I usually, the analogy for me is a PMO office, right? The same evolution that engineering and IT went through and then came up with a PMO office to hold everything together. As we're going through now in the data science space, it's this PMO office. So the equivalent of a project manager, and if they don't have one, then maybe a manager or a director of data science would do it.
Tied to this, I'll throw out one that's not been directly asked, but that I have heard discussed, which is, to the extent that large companies do want to have this be a role, I've had several clients ask me, well, how do we even advertise this, right? We've struggled to actually find specific job postings that seem to directly ask for this, as opposed to having it as part of existing roles, as we've talked about. I guess if you were to post it, even, have you heard of anyone having success with posting for this type of a role? Because I actually, for all the talk about it, I know a lot of people that are taking their internal employees and having them put some time towards this, but I haven't seen very many actual job postings out there that are looking for this as a major part of a role. Have any of you?
Probably not with the title of data translator, but maybe with the title of something like technical product manager.
Yeah, I agree. I think the specific term data translator you may not see, but I think the functionality or the scope of what we're talking about here has been, or you can find examples of that posted under different titles, and it could be a function of the industry, the company, et cetera, on that, and it's all part of the general discussion I think we've been having over the last couple of years around like, what's a data scientist, how do we define all these things? I don't think there's one source of truth or record for all of that, but yeah, I think you can find roles, but the data translator title specifically you may not find too readily, I think.
Okay. So Ilyas, one thing is, I've recently made a move out of industry after many years into academia. I know you've kind of spanned those worlds right now, having a corporate job and doing some teaching. And, the reality is, as I knew coming in, but I'm realizing, just like companies have issues with different business units or departments working well together, universities have trouble with different departments and colleges working together, particularly for some of these interdisciplinary skills that we need. So from your perspective, as both being part of the business world and doing some teaching, what are some of the courses that you would see universities developing, or some of the skills they focus on in these courses to help prepare students for this role, maybe even as they're coming out of school, rather than kind of backing into it after a lot of experience, like many of the people today?
Yeah, so my introduction into academia was actually to solve some of those problems. When I went to the University of Texas, and I told them, hey, I have a stack of resumes coming in, but I can't, and there's jobs, but I just can't assign them because my team isn't ready to spend a year training these people, because they're just not ready to be able to work in in an actual team yet, the response from the dean was, okay, well, why didn't you come fix it then, right? And so I kind of shot myself in the foot doing that. But as a result of that, so I realized that there's data science in business, there's data science in CS, there's data science in statistics, there's data science, all over. But the one thing that came through to be able to not just make sure these data scientists are able to get good work done, but also communicate their work, is something I stumbled upon, is what they call experiential learning courses, right? So courses that don't have a fixed curriculum, but that curriculum is sort of derived through projects that they are doing with different companies. So the class I'm teaching now, for example, we have from the beginning, after the first 2 or 3 weeks of courses, where coursework, where they're they just are informed about certain things. From then on, they are working with companies on 2 or 3 projects to the end of the semester. And as part of that, communicating their work, they have to sell their work back to the company to say, hey, isn't this really useful? And as a result of that, why would you like to hire us to come into your company and then come and do this work, right? So that experiential learning structure of courses and exposing these students to the clients from the very beginning, it almost organically makes them communicate better, because essentially their job depends on it, right? And then so through that, we've seen a great deal of success, and now we are seeing these experiential learning courses kind of proliferate across all the other disciplines as well.
Yeah, I'll throw out the course I'm teaching is also an experiential learning course where the team, it's almost like a reality show. The students are broken into teams, and they have to develop an analytics plan, and they have to go execute that plan. They present it to us on an ongoing basis, sometimes with the clients, sometimes just with the faculty. We critique it. We tell them what to, how to adjust. And what I found is, I wish we had done this when I went through school, my undergrad and grad programs. There were no such things as this. So anyone out there working for a company, consider whatever your local universities are, reach out and see if you can be the sponsor of one of these experiential learning or capstone courses. There's a couple different terms that might be utilized, but the advantage of it is you can actually get some great insights from these students, but then you get to see, like in our case, 20 master's students across stats, computer science, MBA, and IS, all in a room together. You watch them for a semester presenting, and a lot of them happen to be graduating this spring. What a great way to screen who are you going to go target, and we get people hired out of that as well. So I think it's not just great for the students, but if you're in an organization, I would ask that you consider reaching out to your local university and getting involved in that way, because it's pretty easy to do, and it's very valuable on both sides. Eric, I guess I know you've also been involved from your roles with the local universities. What's your thought on that intersection of the universities and the private sector through helping them learn?
Yeah, so I think the thing that you both mentioned, and I'll reinforce, is that experience piece, right? And it's one thing to pick up or try and learn what it means to be a data translator, or all the skills that you might need to be a good data translator in a classroom environment. But until you actually apply it, and apply it a lot, I don't think you really are going to be good at this data translator role. So that's why, and I think we talked a little bit earlier about, Bill, you had mentioned you thought it might be a kind of a senior role, and I would tend to agree. I think depending on the organization of the company, you might have an entire team of translators with different levels of seniority and align based on the complexity of the project, et cetera. But it's really that experience. So capstones and internships, any kind of work experience, I think, are great ways to build that experience, and then that connection to academic institutions to enable the apprenticeship, let's say, or the internship are key, right? So I think developing those are going to be key. But again, just doing a one-off capstone or an internship or two doesn't necessarily make you a Jedi master, right? You need potentially years of working on this, or at least some prolonged period of time. And I think we've seen some companies, probably more on the tech side, let's take Google, for example, where maybe there's an apprenticeship kind of program that they have, where they bring in new graduates realizing that they may have very sharp and great technical skills, but they're lacking that experience piece. And I think we're going to see more of that kind of apprenticeship thing type, happen. And we may wind up looking, there may be these centers where, in CPG, and it may still be true, it used to be if you're looking for a good marketer or brand person, you would try and recruit from P&G, because P&G really taught you how to do brand and marketing really well. You wanted someone who did that. So we may find that we're going to look towards Amazon or Google or whoever, or Microsoft, I should say, to source our data translators. We may find something that looks like that, but it takes a lot of experience, a lot of work to practice this to get it right, I think.
Well, I think the good thing you said there was that practice. I think it's true of everything, right? This is another area where you don't just decide you want to do these things today and suddenly tomorrow you're ready. I think even those of us who are experienced in doing analytics, it took me years of practice to finally get to where I feel like I can put together a presentation that a business person's going to, be able to understand. When I started out, I wasn't good at that. And I think it's like everything. And so that's great, great reinforcement. I guess, another aspect of this we haven't talked about yet, and Shanshan, maybe you could chime in on this. So we're talking about this role, interacting with business, interacting with analytics, kind of this go-between, which means you're getting in each of those organizations' business in a way. How are those lines drawn so that you're facilitating progress and being helpful, but not having everyone think you're invading their turf?
Well, I think to start, the organization should look at what problems it wants to solve and what problems it wants a data translator to solve. So if there's a general problem, which is we're not leveraging our analytics function, maybe that isn't the time to immediately hire data translators. Because if, for instance, that is caused by lack of clear ownership, then having a data translator team would actually make problems worse and not better. So I think to start, the organization needs to take stock of problems that it wants to solve and what specifically a data translator will do. But I think beyond that is just about cultivating trust and understand that when you have a new function, when you're working on new projects, things may not be great immediately. It does take some time to understand everyone's role. And I think if you have the organizational culture and process to facilitate that, then in the long term, it'll be a good investment. I personally think, and again, probably coming from the perspective of smaller companies, I personally think it's good to not draw very strict lines. Because you want to have some flexibility to how collaborations evolve. You also want to leave some flexibility to how individuals on teams want to grow. There could be data scientists who want to grow more in a business sense. There could be data translators who want to, learn more about logistic regression. So I think by not drawing those very strict lines, you also, leave flexibility and you leave the team to develop synergy the way that makes most sense.
Ilyas, you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, I have seen this problem become, or this become less of a problem maybe in the last 2 or 3 years, with most organizations kind of switching from sort of, highly structured to more agile, like structured teams, and, the Spotify model or whatever, where you have individual teams and the data scientists are kind of spread out over all the groups. So I think in general, the culture of most companies is already switching away from highly structured groupings. So I don't see them as, looking at these data translators too much as stepping on their toes. But at the same time, what I do see is that the data translators need to know how to say what they're saying to these different people so that they don't, push themselves in a corner and paint themselves as just being sort of not being able to get what's the real problem that the business is trying to face, right? So I think as long as they're able to communicate that way, I don't see them as stepping on the toes just because of the organizational structures that we have.
Hey, we had one question come in about the best advice for explaining analytic results to non-technical audiences. Now, this is a great one. So I promised everybody out there, I don't know the person who asked this question. I didn't pay them to ask this question, but I'm literally in the middle and just finished my first draft of a book on this very topic that'll be coming out in about a year. about presenting information to non-technical audiences. And I guess I'll distill my thought down into a quick sentence here, and then maybe each of you could take a stab. In my mind, it's you sort of have to dumb down your information, and I don't mean that in the negative way. I mean, make it until you feel like it's oversimplified. A non-expert at that point, maybe you're in the range of it's at how complex they can handle it, right? When I go to my car mechanic, I need to know very, very basic what they're going to be doing in that car. I'm not a mechanic. I'm not good with engines and so forth. So to them, they might feel like they've oversimplified it and they're not giving me enough detail, but in fact, they often are. So I think it's finding that way to say, from the lens of the person I'm communicating it to, how much can they really handle it? How much do they actually need to know? The reality is, a marketing person needs to know, yep, I should go ahead and roll out that campaign or not. All of the crazy data preparation and modeling you did doesn't necessarily matter that much to them, as long as they trust that you did it. So I don't know if anyone else has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, Bill, I'm going to be jumping off here real quick, so I just want to chime in. I usually, try to convince my teams to tell stories, right? And so building the storytelling capability to be able to say, well, here's where things are, and here's then what happened, and as a result, this is what people like. Have you ever noticed this when you're in a session and somebody says, hey, this one time, and then everybody's ears just perk up, right? Because they want to know what happened that one time. They could care less what you said the rest of at the talk. So I usually, I try to tell my teams to learn to tell stories, and when you start telling stories, you realize the stories have to be simple and clean, right, and easy to understand, and then it also makes you not seem like you're trying to overly simplify things for others, but you speak a different language, right? When you tell that story, you're both speaking that same language. It makes things a little easier to communicate.
And then we get back to the literacy thing. You're telling a story that they can comprehend. So
yeah. Let's
do this. We only have a couple minutes left. I want to give you each a minute or so to give a final thought, and I'll do some wrap-up summary. So, we've kind of been focusing on the here and now. Let's just take it up one notch and say, in the 3 to 5 year time horizon, as we look forward, how does the role of a data translator and the demand and usage of that role change? I guess, Eric, let's start with you. And Eric
there we go. Sorry. I've hit all the classic faux pas on the video chat today, so I'm your guy. I think what we'll see is, again, I think the idea of a data translator, as we talked about earlier, the title itself isn't maybe so prevalent in companies or in job postings. I think we'll start to see a little bit more definition around that, whatever it means to whatever particular company, or maybe it's an industry-wide thing, but hopefully there's some standardization on what those skill sets are, so that there's a kind of common language for folks who are in that profession or doing that kind of role, at whatever company or wherever they're at, right? So I think we'll start to see a little bit more of that. And then in response, and if we follow history in what's happened with like data scientists, et cetera, I think we'll see academic institutions or professional societies create degrees or certifications or things that will kind of qualify people as good data or analytics translators, right? And then, as I mentioned, I think we'll see more of that apprenticeship model pop up. And Ilyas, I neglected to mention IBM as one of those centers for apprenticeship that I'm sure we'll see good data and analytics translators come out of IBM. But I think it looks a little bit maybe like an IT business analyst role, but plus, with maybe more business on the business analyst side of it. And whatever it is, I think there will be a need for folks in that role to continuously learn. And so I think there'll be continuing ed kind of things that need to happen, maybe recertifications, because technology is constantly changing. I'm having to now on a maybe quarterly basis go learn all the new buzzwords or apps or things that are in the ecosystem around analytics and data, and it's tough to keep up with it. So I think we'll also see that kind of capability, whether it's in academic institutions or third-party professional societies or other things. We'll see that continuing ed support this data and analytics translator role. Anyway, that's my last thought.
All right. Maybe Ilyas and then Shanshan to close it out.
Sure. So I used this analogy already a couple of times, which is this equivalent of the PMO. So I think just like that has grown, I think we might have certifications like, just like the PM Project Management Institute has, project management certifications. I think there might be data translation like certifications. And as people get those, they would want to do that so that they can get into higher roles and as the data management office, and then lead up as a career path all the way up to being the chief of staff of a chief data officer or something like that. I kind of see that as a path going up.
I think if I were to make a prediction about the future, my best guess is that what we think of as skills and responsibilities of data translators will become standard toolkit for product managers, project managers, and program managers in the next 5 years.
Great. Well, I'll thank all of you for attending. And just a couple points I took away just as we went. I'd say I think the consensus seemed to be up front that data translators and analytics translators more or less the same thing, just depending on the setting it's used, but the role's the same. We talked about setting the tone by acknowledging and encouraging this role in your organization, whether you charter it as a full-time job, as a part-time thing. Make clear it's important that this is getting done. I thought there was a really interesting quote. I think it was you, Shanshan, that maybe one of the most important parts of a data translator is knowing what they don't know, but more importantly, what they don't need to know. And I know that's something that all of us technical people struggle with, is we always want to know everything about everything we touch. And there are times that you don't need to know everything. That's why you have teammates. I think this idea of experiential learning, I think to be a good data translator, it almost by definition comes from a lot of experience. So look for those opportunities to get yourself experiential learning, give opportunities to others through things like working with universities to do that. We had that little bit of conversation about the two-way street of literacy. You've got to communicate well as having people understand. We talked a little bit about not drawing too firm of lines around this role, let it kind of play out given your own organization and the politics. And then we may see, as we move forward, things around certificates, certifications, courses, just like you do with other things. So I think those are just some of the thoughts I had. Again, I think we're right about a minute from time. I'll thank Eric, Ilyas, and Shanshan. I think this is a really good conversation. And I thank all the audience for coming, and we will sign it off. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.